Now, it does me great pleasure to introduce our co-host for today, and I have the privilege of being able to share this space also with my colleague Lauren Dike, who's going to be co-facilitating. But I want to introduce Julie Kratz, and as I normally do, I'm going to give her a formal introduction, and then I will allow her just to come forward and share with us in her own way who she is, things that we may not be able to know about her if we, just by reading her bio. And so we're gonna allow her to welcome us in her own way in just a second. Julie Kratz is a highly acclaimed speaker and trainer who led teams and produced results in corporate America. After experiencing her own career pivot point, she developed a process for women leaders to build winning plans. Promoting gender equality in the workplace, Julie is a TEDx speaker, a frequent keynote speaker, and executive coach. She holds an MBA from the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University, is a certified master coach, and is a certified unconscious bias trainer. Her books include Pivot Point, How to Build a Winning Career Game Plan, One, How Male Allies Support Women for Gender Equality, and Lead Like an Ally, a journey through corporate America with strategies to facilitate inclusion. Meet Julie at nextpivotpoint.com and watch her speaker reel by visiting the link that we're going to drop into the chat right now. But Julie, just provide a welcome for us. Greet this audience. We're so excited that you're here. And again, we feel seen, valued, and heard the moment that you said yes to our invitation, and we don't take that for granted. So how are you?
Thank you. Thank you. And as somebody that's followed your work and your organization for quite some time, it's a real honor to be invited into this conversation. Dr. Nika, I think, to expand on my why for this work, I'm a big fan of allyship in the workplace and having those workplace cultures where we all feel seen and heard and feel a sense of belonging. And so that's what brought me into this work after I spent 12 years in corporate America and never felt those feelings. And, in the time when you're in it, you don't know why that is or what that feeling of just emptiness, not feeling like it could be better. I didn't know how to describe it, but I didn't see myself reflected in the organization. It was very what we call male, stale, and pale.
Yep, male, stale, and pale. Yep.
And I just thought, wow, it can be better than this. So when I started my own business as a white woman, and as we were talking before, diversity just wasn't as much of a thing inside organizations. I decided to focus on gender and the experience of women and how women can be better leaders. But fast forward, over the last 7 years, the conversation's changed, and intersectionality is a big part of that. And when I engaged men as allies, a lot of times men of color were more likely to participate in the conversation. So I've had some light bulb moments over the course of my work and my books and the talks that I've given to be like, hey, we need all voices included in this conversation. People that are most marginalized cannot be having this conversation alone. When you're dealing with the systems that keep people down, it's not effective to also require that group to educate everyone else on what it's like when I'm also experiencing it. So just for all those reasons, having a broad lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion has been part of my journey and one that I'm really passionate about.
No, that is great. Well, we're so glad you're here. I'm going to let my colleague Lauren jump in with the next question, but thank you for sharing your DEI story. I think that everyone who's in this space is probably because they have a DEI story that's caused them to be connected to this work. And so I appreciate you bringing that to the fore for us. Lauren?
Yes, thank you for sharing, Julie. So I want to start with the basics. Can you share with everyone what it means to be anti-racist and why it's important for white people to be involved in this work?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And, anti-racism, I think we can attribute to Ibram Kendi's work with how to be an anti-racist and really elevating why just saying I'm not a racist is not enough. And in studying his work and getting more involved in anti-racism in my own journey, it's become really clear that white people just don't understand the experiences of people of color. And there's a few reasons for that. I mean, still here in the United States, 75% of white people live in white communities, and myself included. I do not live in the most diverse area, and that's definitely something I'm being intentional about. But if we can't see other people's experiences, just by way of exposure, I think white people are more likely to judge. Like, does that really happen? Is that really a thing? You know, and I tell white people, like, if someone shares a story with you a few different times, or you read the same thing about a policing situation, there's probably some truth to it. Like, don't blame or shame the victim. And, you know, when you think about being an anti-racist, I think the biggest thing for white people is listen. You know, show up to listen and learn. Let's not judge. Let's not blame. Let's not say, oh, I'm woke. You know, you don't get to call yourself an ally even. Allyship is very much in the eye of the beholder. And so one of my greatest honors in this work is when someone does share with me, you've been a great ally for me. That's great validation of, okay, I must be doing something right. And allyship is a journey. It is not a destination. So, you know, learning about anti-racism, continuing to show up in the conversation about anti-racism is a really important part of that journey. There's so much more work that we can all do. I think, you know, be willing to meet people where they're at too on their journey. You know, everyone's at a different place. Education is a huge part of that journey. And just being willing to challenge your past assumptions about race or the assumptions you have made, maybe based on your own limited experiences, and realize there's a big, broader world of observations, just being open to that. I call it kind of putting your ally radar up to be looking for things that don't feel right. You know, be an upstander, say something when you see something that's not right. Educate others. And I know a topic near and dear to my heart that we'll talk about is especially little people. You know, if you have children or, you know, have little people in your life, like, have this conversation earlier, because waiting until we're adults, much like we do in our work every day, is a little fleeting, because your biases are pretty well baked. You know, your behavior's already, you know, been cemented over time. So I think starting this conversation early is really important too. And anti-racism is something kids understand, by the way.
Mhm. And I think it's so important to, like you said, educate yourself, because even me being a Black American, I grew up around all white people. I don't even think I thoroughly understood what racism meant.
Right.
And, you know, I had friends when George Floyd happened, and they were sort of like, oh, come on, racism only happens in the South. Like, I think people are being dramatic, but it's like racism is systemic. It's a fact that it exists. And understanding that, I think, is the first step, because there's a lot of denial out there or resistance to understanding what it really is.
Yeah, absolutely. People of color are not themselves also need education, to your point. And I think one thing that's interesting is our biases, as we all know, we equally have biases towards even dimensions that we're experiencing. So women are very likely to be biased against women, and people of color still have their own biases to unpack. So we're all on this journey, and we're better together if we're on it together.
Absolutely. You mentioning that we all can have a point of time bias against, you know, our own portions of our identity, right? That's internalized oppression, and it perpetuates the problem. So I'm so glad you brought that to the fore. I don't think that we talk about that enough. And unfortunately, I think the reason that internalized oppression shows forth is because many of those individuals that are part of those marginalized, oppressed, disenfranchised communities, they have been so used to hearing that they're less than, that they begin to believe it. And that, I mean, if you just really think about that statement at its core, it's really saddening. It's really saddening. So we have to address the internalized oppression as well if we want to make sure that we are allowing everyone to emerge strong from this the bias and the oppression and the racism that exists right now. So thank you for giving us a chance to amplify that. You mentioned something a moment ago that I want to just touch back on. You said it's important for people to challenge their assumptions. So as a white female who gravitated into this space after really focusing first on gender, and now you're focused on unconscious bias, and you're such a big ally, and I do use that as a compliment to you. So I'm glad that you see that as validating, because your work is tremendous. But what have been some assumptions along your journey that you have had to challenge that now maybe shows forth in the way in which you approach this work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, we can all challenge our own assumptions. So as an ally, you know, a lot of us are imperfect. I call it allies in training, myself included. And I've, said and done things over the years that I think has not been very helpful. And unfortunately falls into the white woman stereotype of us being like the Karen. And, I remember a few things I said as I reflected on this last summer, much like a lot of Americans, of like, how have I contributed to this problem? Where are my blind spots? I remember growing up, one of the things I'll never forget is, my teenage experience. I did have a few friends of color. I lived in a pretty white community, so a few friends. And I remember saying things like, oh, one of my friends' name was Ron. And I was like, oh, Ron, you're like us. You're like a white person. And like how dismissing that was to his identity, and how many people of color have told me that white people have said that as like a compliment, like, which is just, it's totally flawed. And again, I was young, but that is something that I'm like, ooh, I should really apologize for that and write that, because I'm sure that didn't feel good. And also, you mentioned something like policing. I think this is really hard for white people to understand, because when I'm pulled over by the cops, I feel safe, right? Because as a white woman, my life is being protected, and that's very aligned with how police have served over the years. And when you compare notes with people of color, and the feelings they have when they're pulled over are vastly different. I remember, again, back in my teenage years, a friend of mine that was Black, his name was Robert, and I remember we all hung out at the same house. And it was one of those houses that was like off that like straightaway road that was like 25 miles an hour, but no one went 25, right? So I always did like 35, never got pulled over, of course. Well, Robert, it was like on a monthly basis, he would get pulled over. And I no kidding, this came out of my mouth. I remember saying to him, like, what are you doing? Like, why are you driving so dangerously that you get pulled over all the time? And just plain as day, he looked at me, he's like, Julie, it's because I'm Black. And I was like, well, what does that have to do with anything? I just did not understand, because my lived experience was so different. And so I think, to your point, Dr. White, I think thinking about my own assumptions, that my own microaggressions over the years, my own biases where I've shown up in the conversation, and just knowing that, these are somewhat innocent things that I did as a child, but it still is not okay. And we always have an opportunity to get better. I had a client a couple of weeks ago give me some really candid feedback, and it really hurt. I had made a statement in a training that really, if I could go back in time, I would have reset it, reworded it differently. But I had said something about, just because someone says something that's potentially racist doesn't mean necessarily that they are a racist. And while I still kind of believe in that fundamentally, that there is a slippery slope of imperfections, because if we're waiting for people to show up perfectly and say everything perfectly, we'll probably wait forever and won't say anything. But the way she took it, she goes, I have 3 Black sons. You kidding me? Like, that's a life or death thing. And that perspective, right? My perspective was so different on that. I have no idea what it's like to have Black sons or children and be worried. And so being really clear, the next time we did a training, I was really open and honest about that, of like, I screwed something up a couple of weeks ago, and I just want to apologize for what I said. There's absolutely boundaries. And I was talking more about microaggressions, not macroaggressions, or obviously violent things. So I just want to make sure that boundary is clear. And, I'd like to hope I righted that wrong, but I say that because we all have our own lenses that we look at in the world, right? We're all looking at the world through our own experiences. And that's why allyship is so hard, because it requires you to understand a perspective that you don't have yet. Right. So that's perspective taking. I know we talk a lot about in our work, being willing to like look at the other perspective and be like, that's so different than mine. And I'm going to listen instead of judge it, which kind of, when someone says something like, I just don't see racism, I'm like, deep breath. Like, are you kidding me? I just want to go on the offensive. I found that strategy doesn't work so well, though. So listening instead usually gets the conversation further. Although, it's inappropriate the way sometimes people behave. But shaming and blaming usually gets an adverse result.
No, you've said so much just in that segment to unpack, but yeah, that question is one that I cringe at quite often when I hear it too, because here's the thing: the goal is not to not see color. Because you can't erase portions of my identity. I want you to see who I am and appreciate who I am and appreciate the strength of the diversity that I bring. And so I think oftentimes when people say that, what they don't realize is that race is not the problem. Racism is the problem, right? And so we have to really amplify that. And you said something a moment ago that reminds me, oftentimes I will share that, being racist is not about who we are necessarily, it's about what we do. And we need to be able to separate the two, because there are many times that I know of people that are well-intended that do not mean to exercise any type of racist behavior. They don't know better, and it just takes someone calling in that behavior so that they can be willing to have a likelihood change in behavior going forward. And so and I think that without that distinction, it causes some people to automatically become so offended when someone says, hey, what you just did and said, while you didn't really probably mean for it to land on someone that way, it was racist,
Yeah.
And it's like, then they feel attacked as a person instead of, calling in the behavior, which we know as allies, we need to be able to do that. And it requires having safe spaces to do that. So, yeah.
I agree. It's like when I like saying the term call people in instead of call people out. It's instead of being like, oh, what you said was so racist. Like that conversation, you know where that's going. It's like, any opportunity to change them. They're going to just defend all the reasons why they're not, and they're probably not even real reasons. But still, right, call people in and say, hey, what you just said, right? And what you're saying, Dr. White, isolate the behavior, right? Focus on the thing you said, the thing you did that was unhelpful, versus you are an ist.
Yes, absolutely.
Julie, so I love what you said about it being important for white people to be in this space and be anti-racist and be allies. And I think it's so important for the accountability piece that it is a white person doing it. Because if you're in a circle of people and someone says something racist, me as a Black woman calling that out, it's like, of course, it's like the eye roll, of course, she's going to say that. But I'm curious, when you're encountering someone that's either covertly or overtly racist, and you're trying to hold them accountable and educate them, personally, like if I'm seeing a troll in a comment, if I call them out, of course she's calling them out, and then I just get angry and I'm like, okay, I'm walking away. But have you ever seen a shift in a mindset? And if so, how did that process occur?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think you really underscored the need for allies because when you say something, it seems like you have quote unquote skin in the game, right? And pun intended. But as a white person, when I say something like that was potentially problematic, or hey, that what she said might been perceived to be racist, people like take note, like, oh, she's speaking up about this. This doesn't seem like something she would care about. So while that's totally unfair, I think that's a privilege that white people have, especially white women, to step into the conversation and to own and to manage so that doesn't fall squarely on the shoulders of people that are most marginalized. But to answer your question, Lauren, I think, when you think about shifts and helping people move from point A to point B, a lot of my research shows on allyship, the broad swath of, people globally, when you survey them or ask them about their perceptions around equality, most people will say, I believe in equality, about 80%, which the 20% I don't even want to talk about. Like that's just, you can't reach everybody. But 80%, and of that 80%, there's usually, a broad, maybe 30% that's really, really engaged and like the advocates and showing up every day, probably the people that we have here with us today. But about 50% not. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. They're afraid of when I say something. I mean, I just got off the phone with a coaching client, a very well-intentioned white man that said, Julie, I don't want to speak up about this stuff because I'm afraid I'm going to get it wrong. And that is so relevant for so much of the majority group. There's no upside to me speaking up about this, so I will stay silent. Of course, that's not acceptable. But when people don't have the words to say or the tools, they think silence is the only option. And so again, I think when I see the biggest shifts is when I see people just express a bit of curiosity. And that's what I'd encourage. If you have, I know everyone's probably thinking about the problematic family member they have, or like the deeply, challenging coworker. I wouldn't start there, right? That 20%, if they don't want to get it, they're not going to get it. We have a much bigger opportunity for that majority group, that 50% that doesn't know what to say, doesn't want to do, but really does want to be helpful and really does believe in equality. And I find just, sprinkling in a little knowledge from here to there, like, hey, did you check out this article? Hey, did you see this? My coaching client, when he said that, a white man, white, straight, cisgender man, was asked to be the head of an LGBTQ plus initiative. And he's like, why me? And he didn't see a lot of upside in even doing that. And that's a big problem, right? And so I just simply shared a documentary. Disclosure, people probably have seen this on the VodCast, but it's great about transgender awareness. And I said, hey, if you're afraid you're going to stick your foot in your mouth, watch this. This might give you like a really helpful perspective and also a strong why for why you need to be involved in this. And I can't change the minds of anybody. I can't wave a magic wand and want him to do this or want other people to read books and listen to documentaries and things that are needed. But I can just sprinkle in some things like, hey, did you see this? Hey, did you check out this? What did you think about that? And it's amazing over time, consistent, intentional series of events can really change and shape minds. And that's why this diversity work, as we all know, it's never ending. It's going to go on forever. It will expand way beyond our lifetimes, which depresses me and also really makes me happy to be a part of a legacy like that. But it has to be intentional. It has to be consistent. And you have to give people space for grace. Like they are going to screw it up. And if you can just say, hey, I know you meant good with that, but hey, here's a better way to say that next time. That type of coaching goes a long way.
I love it. Space for grace. Yes, we have to extend grace and we have to accept grace because we all are going to make mistakes, right? Even the ones of us who are deeply committed to this work. I tell people all the time that, we're constantly learning, and we're making mistakes along the way, but let's fail forward. And I think part of failing forward and growing better, it requires us to be open when someone does call in a behavior that needs to be checked. So we can't get offended by that. We have to see it as an opportunity and see it as a gift, and maybe even start practicing saying thank you when someone brings that to your attention, that can help change our mindset. But I love the discussion of the need to normalize these conversations because they are so important. And it does us no good if we were to pretend that it's going to go away if we don't talk about it, right? And so I just want to get a poll going with this audience quickly. We have touched on some topics, some questions so far that out of the gate for some communities may seem, whoa, you're going to start there, you're not going to ease in. And Julie was well prepared for that and said, yes, bring it on. So we've been co-creating this experience together. But we do recognize that having conversations about race, white privilege, racism, it's not always easy. So there is a poll that's out there, and I want you to take a moment to answer the poll. And it's simply, how comfortable do you feel having a conversation like this in the workplace? So let's just kind of see where our audience is on that. Take a chance to cast your vote, your response, and we'll come back to it in a second just to see how people are reacting. So I want to move a little bit further, and I want to talk about white Saverism, right? We know that it's real. We know that it has some negative implications, but we also know that people's intent, if they find themselves in that posture, is not always to create harm. So again, it's one of those conversations that we have to have some dialogue around. And so talk to us about white Saverism and what it is, how it shows up, and why we need to be aware of the potential implications.
Yeah, I appreciate the realness of that question. It is a very real thing. So what white people do when they learn that something has happened that's racist or problematic, much like the events of last summer, what white people think is helpful is to be like, okay, I'm going to go save the day for you. I've got this. Let me put on my rescue cape and make everything better. I have totally fallen into this trap. I've made this mistake over the years. Good intentions, right? Just bad behavior for obvious reasons. I mean, think about the perception of people of color, like, oh, great. Like you just realized this 2 seconds ago and you're going to make it all better. I've been living in this skin for my whole life. Right. And I think that's also, it's making it about you. Allyship's not about you. And so when you're an ally for somebody, that means you kind of park your own beliefs, assumptions on the sideline, and you're engaging and making it about the other person. So when you're being a savior, that's about you and your ego. So just reminding yourself of that. Am I doing this for them, or am I doing this because it feels good for me to save the day? Unfortunately, this narrative plays out a lot in films and in our media too. Men as the white knight is a very common fairy tale story that I know as a kid that grew up in the 80s and 90s, I saw way too often. But also, I mean, even a great movie like Hidden Figures is riddled with white saviorism. There's a really funny Saturday Night Live spoof on that that I found really interesting. And a very close personal colleague that we collaborate on a podcast together shared that video with me last summer, and she told me she was really nervous about sending me that video, and I was like, what? Like, why would you not want to share that with me? I was just making fun of white saviorism. And she said to me, I've had to tiptoe around white people my whole life, and I didn't want to upset you. And I thought, whoa, like this is some deep stuff, right? If she doesn't feel comfortable sharing that with me, like, and that's because all that lived experience is being quiet about this, just taking the breadcrumbs as we go and not making white people feel uncomfortable. That's super problematic because we know it takes discomfort for change. And when you're the white savior, you're not really uncomfortable. You're just trying to problem solve and almost like whitewash it away. It minimizes the root causes of the issue too, that again are systemic and deep. And I'll just share, one story where I did this, good intentions, but a few years ago, actually the same woman I was mentioning, we were just doing a meet and greet from LinkedIn, which I see all these great LinkedIn profiles being shared. Highly encourage you all to check, have a virtual coffee, get to know each other. And I was doing this with a woman that now we co-host a podcast together. And she shared a story about her daughter, who at the time was 3. And it involved a boy at school telling her that she did not belong there, presumably about her race. And it escalated, and they ended up having to change schools. It was like a whole thing. And what my response was, no, that is so wrong. We have to solve this problem together. Let's start a podcast. Now, it's a really good outcome. Like, luckily, she didn't see it as white saviorism, but in hindsight, it probably was. I'm so glad that it got me on the journey to have this conversation earlier with kids. So many great things came from that. But, we have this like flip trigger in us that just wants to make it better for somebody else. When you see someone in pain, for people that are parents, when you see your kids in pain, you just want the pain to go away. Good intentions, just not helpful. And so reminding yourself, it's not about me as an ally. And why am I really doing this? And we really think about your motivation.
Thank you, Julie. Well, I first want to address the poll. How comfortable do you feel having a conversation like this in the workplace? And we have about 90% of the audience saying they're either very comfortable or somewhat comfortable, and then 10% are somewhat uncomfortable. There's no one that's very uncomfortable, but that just is eye-opening to see how people are at right now with these conversations. So, Julie, I want to ask you, we talked about white saviorism and how ego is involved kind of with the virtue signaling and making it about yourself. On the other end, there's people that are doing it right, where I feel like there's still ego involved, meaning I call it kind of like elitism and being woke, where people are like, they can spit every fact about racial history and they think they're too good to post anything on social media because I've always been educated and people, it's a trend now, or they're condescending to other people who are just learning. And then there's also ego involved with just being scared and they stay silent. So how can someone of color encourage someone who is white to be vocal and to participate? Because at first I was split a bit about being vocal on social media, because sometimes it seems performative and it's a quote unquote trend, but it is important to keep the conversation going, and you never know whose eyes are going to touch your content and who you can educate. So I think it's important for people to continue pushing out content, but how can I, as someone of color, encourage someone who has their ego involved and who's hesitant to do anything?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a rich question. Yeah, I think a lot of people think they're more woke than they really are too. Right? Like, I read 12 books on anti-racism last year. Like, I could write my own book about it. Like, yeah, again, it's a journey, not a destination. And it requires curiosity and listening and learning. So if you ever think you're at a destination point, you're not really there, right? And more importantly, you definitely have some more work to do if you ever think your work is done. So I think it's really important just to recognize that fact and to coach people of allies. It's a continued learning process forever. But for people of color that want your white friends and communities to speak up more, I think just addressing the elephant in the room, like address it right up front. Like, I know this is probably uncomfortable. Like, I know it's probably hard to talk about this. And I think that's kind of painstaking for Black and brown people. Like, really, I'm experiencing racism, but now I have to like tiptoe around you because you're scared of talking about racism. So I get that sentiment. But I think just diffusing it and just putting it out there of like, hey, this isn't an easy conversation for anybody to have, myself included, but your voice really matters. Like, you are influential. Like, people will look to you as a white person and might listen to your voice more than mine. And one of my really good colleagues and friends, Erica, we always compare notes about these things. And her biggest advice to me, last summer, I think like a lot of white people, even being in the space, it was like, I don't want to make it about me. I just want to amplify the voices of Black and brown people doing this work. And she said, I will never forget, like she said it very candidly to me, a week or so after George Floyd's death. She's like, we need you to speak up. And what I need from you is to keep talking. And I was like, challenge accepted. And so every day I'm posting something, her and I trade books and, resources and hold each other accountable. Like, we just went for a walk the other day and talked about racism for an hour, it's really nice to have that kind of friendship because she holds up the mirror for me to see what I don't see. But she'll be the first to tell you, the questions that I get to ask her now, I've earned the right to ask those questions. We built trust over time now that we've worked together for many years, but I'll ask silly white people questions. And these are things that white people are deeply curious about, but don't know how to ask. Like, before the pandemic, I went roller skating with my daughter, and I noticed it was a very diverse space. Like, we were one of the only white people roller skating. And I was like, that is really interesting. And then we went ice skating a couple weeks later. It was the opposite. And I was like, what is up with that? Like, why do Black people roller skate but not ice skate? Like, that's a huge general assumption and definitely not the right way to say that. But I just say that because I was able to say that to her because she invited me into the conversation. And I knew I didn't have to like orchestrate what I was going to say. It didn't have to sound perfect. And so it was really beautiful what she said. She said, roller skating is a form of dance, Julie. It's like, I did not know this. Like, I did not make the connection. And there's a whole socioeconomic issue, which that also was like, duh. But I say all that to say, like, I don't think people of color need to make white people feel uncomfortable or dance around us, but just diffusing the difficulty of starting the conversation and just being okay as you build trust and someone continues to show up, being okay with us, again, not getting it right 100% of the time.
Yeah, I love that, Julie. And then also doing our own personal homework where we are educating ourselves. I often say resources abound, right now. I mean, they did then, but certainly resources have increased significantly over the past 12 months. And so I appreciate your stories. And by the way, let me just comment on the fact that a lot of your vulnerability and your honesty, this audience is really gaining a lot of value from it. So thank you for being willing to put yourself out there. We really do appreciate it. So as we're talking about the necessity of having these conversations, we can't just assume that it is essential to have conversations with other adults. We need to be starting this conversation with young people really, really early. And Julie, you have provided an incredible resource and tool that I want us to talk about. It is Little Allies. And I know earlier we actually dropped the link to your book into the chat. We'll do it again so that it's easy for people to lift. But talk about what inspired you to write Little Allies, and for people that are going to see it as a great resource and order it, what can they expect and look forward to?
Thank you. Well, thank you for the spotlight on that work. It is the area that I'm most passionate about right now. Having been on the ally journey myself for many years, what it's like to have conversations with adults that, again, are pretty well baked in their behavior and their bias. It's like riding a ship that's been sailing forever. And so having this conversation earlier with kids is so important. But again, as I went on that journey, I found that I myself stumbled and didn't know how to say or do the right thing. It started off with talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Day with my daughter. She's off school. Let's watch a video together, listen to the speech, of course, what white people do. And then she's like, well, why did he die, Mom? I'm like, oh no, like, I'm not ready for that question. And then, of course, with George Floyd, she just said, why does this keep happening, Mom? And I didn't have a good answer. I was pregnant at the time. We're all in a pandemic together. And I think for me, I was like, we've got to have this conversation earlier, but parents, caregivers, educators don't know how, and myself included. So, anytime I find a problem that doesn't have a solution, I naturally just did a bunch of research, and we're actively diversifying our bookshelf of kids' books, which is a very intentional and hard thing to do, I think, sometimes too. There are way more kids that are white and even animal characters in children's books than there are Black and brown characters. So it's super problematic. I mean, animals more than, and if you don't see yourself reflected in a book, like, that's just a huge problem. So that was when I found Little Allies, because a lot of the books that we were reading, they were good about diversity, like really great messages, but my daughter really wasn't interested because the story, it was very overt, like, diversity is good. You should care about it. My daughter's like, yeah, I want to read the book with like the funny story. And so it's like, how do you bring these things together? So Little Allies has a playful story within, and one thing I didn't notice in the books I was getting is it's intersectional. So it has all the different dimensions, not all of them, but a lot of the dimensions of diversity: religion, skin color, ethnicity, LGBTQ, gender non-binary, like a lot of different elements of it. So each character has kind of their own little backstory, and the character Allie gets to interact with them. And sometimes she gets it right, and sometimes she doesn't. And sometimes she's a quiet ally. I think a lot of people think to be an ally, I got to like show up at the protest or like, announce this big message. Like, sometimes just sitting with somebody in their pain is how you can be an ally for them as well. So I'm really passionate about it. Thanks for sharing the link in the chat. But people need resources. And I just want to mention, I did share a full list of free resources in the chat as well, because as you get down this journey, I think as if you're wrestling with how to have this conversation with young kids in your lives, I would say it's so important, but you've also got to like do your own education before you get ready for that conversation, because they will ask you some doozies, right?
That is so true. So we're grateful that you've done a little bit of the heavy lifting for us with this great resource. And I'm sure many people in this audience are going to find it fit to place that order and to gift it to a parent of a young child, or to share it as a resource as they're helping their young children or someone that's young in their life to become a more effective ally. I love this. So we do have some questions that have come through from this audience, and I want to invite any of you that if you have not had a chance to present your question, please feel free to drop it into the chat. Our team backstage are pulling out all those questions and putting them in the backstage chat for us. And so let's see, let's go to this first question. This question comes from my colleague, Natasha Poritskova, and this is a good one. How do you handle situations when individuals argue that calling in won't work, that it's too soft of an approach?
Yeah, no, I think it's, all these things have their nuances to them. So again, I think on the spectrum of behavior, if you're dealing with some egregious, very bad behavior, probably not a microaggression, a macroaggression, something very wrong, it absolutely has to be addressed right away. So I think just knowing that softer approach, if something is very harmful, it absolutely, like, time out. We've got to talk about this. We have to address this. Your behavior is unacceptable. There's a great book on that subject by the same author that did Radical Candor. I know that's Kim Scott. So a white woman, and she's very, very overt about her own level of privilege in this conversation, but she breaks it into 3 categories. There's bias, and then there's prejudice and discrimination, and then there's bullying. And so bullying has to be addressed like head on, right? Versus bias, maybe there is a call-in, softer approach, and then discrimination, kind of very situational, but definitely highlighting that's unacceptable is key. So yeah, depending on the spectrum of behavior, it has to be matched with an equal level of seriousness. We can't let people get away with bad behavior. And I think more often than not, what I see in workplaces is like there is someone that's problematic and they might even be on the leadership team. And we kind of let it go because that's the way he is. It's like, ooh, that's a problem, right? Because we just told everybody. I think knowing that if we don't say anything, it's the same as saying that's okay. And that behavior will continue. So I'm okay with that behavior continuing. So I think for allies that want to be more vocal or get more people involved in the conversation, that's what I usually coach people on. So are you willing to say something? Like, I don't know. I'm like, well, if you don't say something, that's going to happen again. Are you okay with that? Oh, well, no, I'm definitely not. Sounds like you got to say something. Right? And so I think matching seriousness in these conversations is really important.
I agree. Thank you, Julie. We have our next question is from Sophie, and she asked, I'm curious, is there a term for people partaking in white saviorism?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, correct me on this one. This might be more, I think I've just heard people being called, white saviors. That's been my experience. Correct me if you've seen differently.
Same. And I think there's an element of people that just aren't aware that they're doing it. So it might be like, I'm just being me. So yeah, I haven't heard a more formal term for it either.
And white women, I would say, are really problematic with this. Like there's another term I like, white guilt is very real. So a lot of times, and this happened so much last summer. And so just to make fun of people a little bit like me, and this is a huge stereotype, so forgive me, I don't want to throw all white women into this bucket, but let's have a book club about an anti-racist book, right? And then let's come together and I'll talk about it. And we're going to like come together and solve this problem. It's like, good intentions, right? But that is definitely kind of white saviorism kind of approach of you read one book and you decided to talk about it from a very privileged lens. And you've again made it all about you and what you're going to do to right this wrong. So just realizing this partnership that's needed. I think what's missing when we go into white savior mode is we don't think we have to work together. Like we all need to work together. And this again is why we need allies, because it's not white people or brown people or Black people or now Asian Americans that are experiencing this. They're so much stronger together. And I think, one last thing I'd say on this is it's kind of like this divide and conquer strategy that's been used by white supremacy culture and the patriarchy of like, women, you fight this battle. People of color, you fight this. Now you're seeing it between Black Lives Matter and Asian, Stop Asian Hate. It's like, these are not conflicting messages. These are together, like yes and conversations. These aren't either or conversations, but that's a really effective strategy to keep us from all advancing together. And I'm just not going to let that work. Like my life's work is like that woman's conversation is not different. It is different, but we're stronger when we're having that conversation about women of color's experience and the LGBTQ plus community's experience and all of our experiences together rather than having them all separately.
Absolutely. Oh, and Lindsay posted a clarification from Sophie. She wanted to know if there is a term for people partaking in white saviorism behavior but are non-white.
Oh, I don't know.
So I guess you would say maybe as far as Black Lives Matter, someone that may be Asian or
okay,
Hispanic. Yeah, my thoughts are that as long as a group is oppressed, I feel like there's some sort of connection and understanding. Yeah, I don't know about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'd have to dig in more. I mean, this is a part of the ally journey. I've never been asked a question like that. I don't have any resources on that, but I'll definitely think on it because it's a profound question.
It's a really good question. So we have the next question from Lindsay Burton, and it says, what are some good resources that you recommend around being educated about conscious bias?
Oh, yeah. There's some great resources on bias. My favorite book is by a woman, Dolly Chugg, The Person You Mean to Be. It's on my resource list if you want to check it out as a recommended book. But I love how she talks about it as like, I think anyone that's attended bias training, like we're all biased, it's managing your bias. Yes. And we're all good-ish people is the way she puts it. And so I really like looking at it through that lens and very much mirrors our conversation today of, hey, it's very rare that you find a purely racist person or a purely bad person, right? They do exist. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. More often than not, there's this like middle ground of like, I'm good intention, but I'm like not always saying and doing the right thing. And so if we just look at it that way, that as humans, we're kind of wired to protect our own interests, to protect our values. And we don't like it when people question our beliefs, our opinions, our values, and we get very like entrenched in it. Instead, just look at it as more of a spectrum. One of the other thought leaders that I really like on just overall, Brene Brown, I think does a great job on empathy, vulnerability, and some of the skills of allyship, even though she talks about it much differently. But I love how she embraces the concept of paradox. Like it isn't either or conversation. It's a yes and conversation. So yes, someone did say something problematic, but that again doesn't mean that they're a horrible person. And if only we had a little bit more leeway for that. And it makes you a better leader too. I think that's what's really interesting about Brene's work is it makes you a more effective leader by embracing paradox and embracing inclusion as well.
Yeah, wait, Natasha just placed into the chat that Brene Brown often comes up in every episode. Yeah, there's lots of Brene Brown fans that are associated with this community. But as you were talking, I placed into the chat holding the middle, because I've heard people use that language as a way to talk about let's not be so steadfast in making definitive statements all the time, but let's ask really thought-provoking questions and have this questioning frame of mind. And that in and of itself can help us reach this middle ground where I think it just opens us up to wanting to learn, listening intently to learn. And I think that's something that we have lost our way with, in some regards. So we, holding the middle is a way to do that. You want to comment on that, Julie?
Oh, no, I was just saying in the chat too, like, I love what you just paraphrased and played back. But Frank, I think he answered our question about saviorism. He said saviors. Just saying saviors. And it's like, I guess you can attach a racial label to that to describe that behavior.
Good point, Frank. Thank you. Thanks for amplifying that. Frank, you're getting some love in the chat because you helped to solve the mystery. But I do think that's probably a good way to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it speaks to what you just said too, of like, hey, let's stay open and stay curious, like not have all the answers. And I think it's really tempting in our DEI work, especially when you've studied this work so much and you've written books and done research about it. Think, okay, I've got it all figured out. And so I really love this conversation because I'm like, hey, I just learned something new. That's the fun part of this work too. But that's the hard part of this work, is that learning never stops.
No, absolutely. So Julie, tell us about some of the clients and organizations that you work with. Who are like ideal clients for you that you think that you are able to really help them to break through the clutter and lead to impact in this body of work?
Yeah, there's three things. So this is something that's been really great to reflect on over the course of the pandemic of, okay, what makes it a good fit to work with? And I'm sure y'all do the same thing. First, intentional. Like you have to be intentional and recognize this is a journey, not a destination. So, the one-off speaking engagements, they sometimes make sense, especially for an event or a program or a keynote. But when I have organizations that come in and talk about allyship and then like go away, no, that's not how this works. Like, I'm not going to work with you. And it's unfortunately, I had a client do that this week. And I just said, I don't think you're going to get the results you want. So I'm not going to participate unless you're willing to do more of a series approach and have some accountability baked into it. So the intention is number one. Number two, it speaks to the same thing, consistency over time. You have to consistently show up in this conversation and have this conversation. We saw this last summer, right? The statements, the donations that were made, and then the lack of action behind it. And that's performative allyship. That is not real allyship. We need active allies that are using their voice every single day. And it's not a choice. Just like not being a racist isn't good enough. Just not being, being aligned with this, but not saying anything is also not okay. So again, intentional, consistent messages over time. And education is a huge part of that. And then the last thing I'd say is the senior leadership team, right? I've had clients before, their senior leadership team. You talk to one of them and like they're clearly on board and they get it, and then you meet the others and you're like, oh no, this is not gonna work. And sometimes they coach those people, and that's always fun. But everyone's can get on the journey. I always go in like they just haven't figured it out yet. Like they just aren't there yet. They will get there. But you have to have really, I'd say, the majority of the leadership team. Every leadership team may have a problem or two, but if your senior leadership team is not bought in on this or believes in it truly in its importance and is unwavering in their commitment to this, then it's just not going to work. So those are the things I usually say right out of the get-go. These are the 3 things I'm looking for to see if we're a good fit. You tell me what we're a good fit, what you're thinking about from a fit perspective, but those you can't change those things, or it's really hard to influence those things as an outsider.
I agree, Julie. Those are some really great tips and lots of synergy around, our approach to this work as well, which I'm not surprised, simply because you're here today, because again, we follow your work, we enjoy your work, we think it's quite effective. I want to actually crowdsource around this next question. So I'm presenting it to you, but I also want members of our community to share their response to it in the chat. And it's simply, what do you wish organizations would do more of as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion? Beyond just getting started, right? Let's assume they're already started and on their journey. What should they be doing more of? And I want to hear from the audience as well. So take that question, Julie.
Yeah, I can't wait to see. I mean, this is part of it's really helpful intel for us, the work we do. What's next? What do we need to do more of? My guess is education, continued education. I mean, that's you and I spend all of our days doing that. But education in itself isn't enough, right? Real advocacy is something I'd like to see more of, like real unwavering commitments. And, when something like happens last week, it's not this like polished corporate statement that doesn't feel genuine or authentic. It's like, of course we said something. We all knew what we needed to say right away without having to run it through our PR team, right? And that's where I just don't think we are, right? I heard so many clients still, knee-jerk reaction, Julie, can I talk to you about what we should say about API? And I'm like, I can't tell you what to say. And if you don't know what to say, then that's a bigger problem, right? That you're still on this journey and you still need to have these conversations more regularly for you to even feel comfortable. And I think that's what's really missing. We're still so in political corrective mode, or cancel culture, all these things going on, where if you don't say the right thing, it's not effective. And I truly believe there can be a more middle ground. And when everyone feels comfortable in an organization clearly speaking up, I had organizations on the other end of the spectrum where they had like their backdrops on Zoom already changed to like stop Asian hate. I mean, it was really cool to see people that got it right away, and then others that were like lingering. And I know we got some chats going here, so this is really fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to call out some of the suggestions in the chat. Sophie says, have more available training sessions, workshops for their internal team. Mauricio, cultural awareness, addressing misconceptions and straight up lies. Conduct unbiased training for recruiters and hiring managers is essential, and conduct before the start of a new recruiting season. And there's tons of other ones. I encourage everyone to refer to the chat. But Julie, this has been amazing. I want to ask you before we close, if there's anything else you want to share with us that we did not touch on.
Oh my gosh, it's been such a rich conversation. I appreciate all the very real questions. This is how I learn. This is how I grow. So I'm just really thankful for inviting me into this space and creating a space where I felt super safe being vulnerable. And I really, just reflecting on some of the chats coming in still now, I think we're at, we were kind of joking about my business name, Next Pivot Point, pivot, who hasn't heard pivot in the last year? But I really believe we are at a pivotal point. The fact that we're almost coming on the year anniversary of George Floyd, and conversations are very, very alive and well inside organizations about diversity and inclusion, that gives me great hope and promise that this work really matters, and that we're not going to stop doing this even when it's not in the news cycle or not cool, and we're doing this for the right reasons. And my clients, what I also think is really exciting is my clients that are really on this journey and have been on it for several years, is they're starting to see results from it. They're starting to get access to better talent. They're starting to get more innovation. Like they're seeing their leadership team like gel and come together in a way that's like super trusting, and they're able to have really hard conversations they weren't able to have before. So that gives me hope and promise, for all the things that still happen that are so unacceptable in our society. I do think, my last thought is that it's really hard to make change on a national level, right? It's really hard to make change, and systemic racism has like 12,000 tentacles to it. And it's easy to throw up our hands and be like, it's just never going to get addressed. We just have to accept it. I don't think that's true in corporate America. And I don't think that's true politically and socially too, but it is going to take a long time. Corporate America, we have a great responsibility to create workplaces that are inclusive. We can make change more quickly and it impacts your bottom line. So that for me is kind of fun in the work we get to do, because it is possible to create change more quickly there. And that could have a huge ripple effect, right, on society and some of the other systems. So that's part of what keeps me up at night, and also part of what gives me a great promise to this.
Thank you so much, Julie. Such good points, such great content that you've provided, and we're so lucky to have you here. I know I'm going to purchase 2 copies of your book for my 2 nieces. I cannot wait for them to read it. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining today's intentional conversation. Please join us next week at 11 a.m. And we will be circulating the recording and the chat and some resources, so look out in your email. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.